2, 1. Hey guys, welcome back to Bible Fun with the Nuns. Today we're studying Mark 14. Let's get started.
Okay, so when you're reading through Mark 14, this was the shortest chapter in the whole Bible, right, John? No, this was a lot. There was a lot jammed in this one chapter. I'm going to tell you what I like about this chapter is that whenever you're reading it, you're able to get like the full spectrum of just how many people were involved in this story. Now think about it. Obviously you have Jesus, but in this one chapter you have Jesus, you have Pharisees, scribes, Sadducees, judges, rulers. You've got Mary, you've got Judas Iscariot, you've got Passover, you've got prayer in the garden, you've got soldiers, betrayal, arrest, you've got a young man who flees naked. Yeah. And then Jesus in front of the court. And then you've got this major story of Peter himself. Now, this is a really big jam up story. Now, one of the funny parts about this story, and it's not really funny, although like the funny word is the word naked. So it says here, now a certain young man followed him, and having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body, the young men laid hold of him, and he left the linen cloth and he fled from them naked. Well, that's a lot of naked in those couple of verses, right? Kind of awkward, right? Here's what you need to know. That's one of the only times you're going to ever find this story in the Bible. So when you read through Matthew and you read through Luke and you read through John, you're not really going to find that detail. And the reason why this detail is in the Gospel of Mark and not in those stories is probably because, now this is a theory out there, but it's one I think is pretty right on. It's that the young man who runs away from the soldiers and runs away from Jesus in the garden, and they grab his shirt and he just pulls out of his clothes and just takes off home, is Mark. So Mark, who wrote this book, that was probably him. And he wrote this story down because, you know, he lived it. So he knew that it happened. There's a lot of other things that happen here. And what I think is important about this story is, Mark tells a story that for him would have been, do you think he was proud of running away like that? Or do you think he was a little ashamed of it?
A little ashamed.
All right. Do you think that you and me and everybody watching, do you think that there are things that we've done that if we could roll the clock back and have a redo, there's some things we'd like to redo because we're also ashamed of those things?
Yeah.
So whenever you read through this story and you come away with, like even the story of Peter, do you think Peter was proud of what he did?
No.
So do you think that all of us have something we're probably not very proud of too?
Yeah.
So whenever we read through this story, is God telling us, is God telling this story to be mean, or is God really just being kind and inviting us into the story and say, look, I love all kinds of people, and that my children are not museum pieces of perfection. My people are broken people who have something to be ashamed of, but I love them anyway. Well, that's what's happening here. John's biggest takeaway was with Peter. Tell us about that.
So, Jackson just got home. Peter, in this little part of the chapter, he denies Jesus 3 times. It's that little story where before the rooster crows twice, he will deny Jesus twice. No, 3 times, sorry. And so, as we were going through this, we talked about it, and it was, Peter was one of the best. He was one of Jesus' disciples, and he was a really awesome person. But even he denied Jesus. And we think, oh my gosh, Peter, he's so bad in this part. But we were talking about it, and we probably would have done it too. And even worse, we probably are doing it today. And yeah.
Yeah. I think that for me, one of my favorite stories comes a little before this, whenever Jesus is having the Last Supper with his disciples. And so they're having this last meal together. It was their Passover kind of meal, their Seder meal. And he's enjoying spending his time with his guys. They probably were ready to celebrate. But when Jesus has this story, has this moment, he's got some really tough words for them. So the story begins with Jesus sending his disciples out to go find a man who's going to be carrying a water jar who has a place for them to celebrate the Passover. And so when you read that story, probably in that story that the two guys that go out to do that are probably Peter and John. And they're sent out in this story. And do you remember what happened just a few days earlier is at the triumphant entry, the disciples were sent into town and they were going to find a donkey, right? Mm-hmm. And they found the donkey just as Jesus said they would find the donkey. And Jesus gave them what to say and they got the donkey. And Jesus knew all the details. Well, it seems that whenever he sends the disciples here to find this man who will give them a room, maybe they've learned by now, hey, whatever he commands, we're just going to go and we're just going to listen. We're just going to obey because they don't back talk. They don't ask any questions. They just go. And while Jesus is there, they begin to be sorrowful because what Jesus said in verse 17, he said, assuredly, I say to you, one of you who eats with me will betray me. In verse 19, and they began to be sorrowful and they said to him one by one, is it I? And another said, is it I? And so while they're celebrating the Passover, Jesus tells them that not everybody who's with them is really with them. He may be present, but he's not really loyal. And when they ask Jesus who it is, he doesn't just come right out and go, well, guys, listen up. It's actually Judas. Judas, you're the bad guy. He didn't do that. I'm wondering if it's not because Jesus is withholding Judas's name to give him every chance to repent. And Judas doesn't take it. But also notice that while Jesus is washing feet, do you know who he also washes? Judas. Let me ask you this. Are you spiritual enough to wash your enemy's feet? It's a scary deal. Well, then the disciples, since Jesus hadn't just come out and said, it's Judas, they begin to say, is it me? Is it me? Is it me? Now, here's what's important. A few chapters ago, they were also arguing. They were arguing about who the greatest is. Now, they're asking, who is it? Who is it? Who is it? But it's not about who's the greatest. Now it's about, am I the one that's going to betray you? Because while this is all going on, I think what all of us know in our own heart, the reason they're asking these questions is because we all know that we're capable of betraying Jesus. Like you said with Peter, we've all got that in us, moment by moment, either in what we do or how we say or what we don't do or say. We can betray Jesus, and we don't want to, but we're capable of it. What I think is beautiful here is that Jesus chooses to sit down and have a meal with all these guys that are going to run, and even Judas. Because when you read through this story, having a meal, to share a meal together is an act of friendship and trust. That's why we say that, we don't say that Judas just turned Jesus in. We say Judas betrayed Jesus. Because Jesus is having a meal with his friends, and Judas was part of that group. Jesus is having a meal, and they're supposed to be loyal and friends. And so when Judas turns on Jesus, that's why we call it a betrayal. I'll tell you something. If you're a follower of Jesus, Jesus considers you his friend. And so when we sin and when we don't acknowledge Jesus in the way we think, in the way we talk, in the way we live, when we're a bad example for other people and we represent Jesus, but we don't represent him well, as his friends, we're not just in sin. Our sin is also betrayal. And so when we read the story of Judas and we read the story of Peter, we don't read these stories so that we can throw stones at them and say, look how bad these guys are. We read their stories and go, we're all capable of that. Probably there's an area in our life where we're actually doing that. But I don't want to. So we ought to repent and we ought to serve Jesus and love him with all our heart, our mind, our soul, and our strength, and our neighbor as ourselves. And we don't want to betray Jesus. We want to obey Jesus. And so as we're headed to the cross in this story, just understand, Jesus went to the cross for Peter, who denied him, for Judas, who betrayed him, and for us, who probably do a little bit of both of each of those. So let's just remember how good Jesus is to us, and let's take this part of the story really, really seriously. Okay? We'll see you tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye.